And yet the post-war Conservative Party had become the agent of hectic and greedy modernistic metamorphosis, tearing up the old railway lines and cutting great new swaths of motorway through hill and forest and dale, licensing the commercial principle in everything from television to elections, contemptuous of tradition, handing the skylines and arbors of our grand and blitzed old seaports to builders and speculators who swiftly made them unrecognizable to the veterans who had made those place names honored and famous. And this was just in the time of Harold Macmillan. If the commander had lived to see the full impact of Thatcherism, he would have felt that there was almost nothing left worth fighting for, or rather having fought for. I have so few vivid memories of him that one may do duty for many. We had gone as a family into Portsmouth for the opening night of The Longest Day. This epic film about the D-Day landings would, I knew from experience, be almost certain to annoy or disappoint the commander in at least one of two ways. The movie would either understate the role of Britain in the historic storming of the beaches of occupied Europe, reversing an ancient verdict by having us invade Normandy, or it would underplay the part of the Royal Navy in this hinge event. In the event, it was grudgingly agreed in the car on the way home that fairness had at least been attempted. There were a few laughs at the expense of the Yanks and their gadgets, and a few reminiscences of the Dieppe raid that had raised the curtain on Normandy. A hellish fiasco in which the commander had helped land the doomed Canadian forces on bullet-swept beaches, with Lord Mountbatten, an especially vain member of the British royal family, as part of his ship's company. But this effort at good cheer was all aimed at erasing what had occurred before the cinema's curtains had parted. My father had come back from the box office with the news that only the most absurdly expensive or the most abjectly cheap seats were now available. He looked quite put out at this. Didn't the throng for this film understand that he had practically been there? Yvonne attempted mollification. Who snapped up the tickets then? The affluent society, I suppose? You have that right, said the commander with bitterness. He had done so much for the Empire, and it had done so little for him in return. If I had had my way, he would have been respectfully escorted to a front row seat, or perhaps a box. But I also admired him for his lack of guile and his dislike for anything that was surreptitious or underhand. While in the Royal Navy, he had indignantly refused any advances from the Freemasons, even though this mafia of the mediocre might, had he but joined them, have swung the difference between being promoted and otherwise. One loyalty was enough for him. His candor and modesty once almost caused me to weep. He told of a senior officer who had asked him if he'd come and help out at a cocktail party on the base. It was explained to him in confidence by his superior that the event was meant to soak up all the bores who hadn't been invited to anything yet. Thank you, sir, he had replied, but I believe I have already received my invitation. Yvonne's face when he told this story in company was a frozen study that I never forgot. The commander lost his proper job in a similarly naive way, feeling himself obliged to tell the boys' school in Oxford, the place which had furnished his last and only economic security, that he had reached the statutory retirement age. Honestly, Eric, the somewhat shambolic headmaster later informed me he had told him. You didn't have to do that. Nobody was going to make anything of it. Nobody had even thought of asking. But now that you have bloody well told us, the Board of Governors has no legal option but to give you a gold watch or something and let you go. And so he went quietly and uncomplainingly as ever. In his last years, in enforced semi-retirement, he did some very small-time bookkeeping work for a medical man of sorts. In the out-of-the-way Oxfordshire village of Sutton Courtenay, where George Orwell is buried and where, when I once visited, the vicar led me to the spot and then said, "Oh, sorry, wrong grave. This one says Eric Blair." Eric Ernest Hitchens' own grave is on Portsdown Hill, overlooking what Arthur Conan Doyle used to call the Narrow Sea. This historic stretch of water was decidedly and historically ours. I do not say Lord St. Vincent is supposed to have told Parliament in the Napoleonic epic that our enemies cannot come. I only say that they cannot come by sea. Here is the chapel where General Eisenhower said a prayer for fine weather and victory the night before the D-Day landings in Normandy. A stained glass window commemorates the modest warrior who later became President of the United States. Commander Hitchens had once assured me, after a visit to my long bedridden grandfather, that he would not make a protracted business of dying. And he was good on his word. He died in 1987, aged 78. Having never spent a day in bed in his life, he went very speedily from diagnosis of an inoperable cancer in his esophagus to a hammer blow heart attack that gave his hostess, his sister Ina, barely any time to rush to his side. My Aunt Ina had also landed on the beaches of Normandy as a nurse in the second wave. Another excellent day's work, and got all the way to Germany before they told her to stop. The commander's funeral took place on a day of bitter and extreme cold. I dismounted from the train at what had once been my homebound station for the school holidays. By macabre coincidence, I was walked through the freezing station yard. I saw workmen painting out the faint storefront sign, Susanna Monday, on what had once been my mother's sad attempt at a dress shop. I was able to see my father in his last repose before the screwing on of the lid, and later to do for him what he had once done for me, and carry him on my shoulders. We laid the coffin in the chancel of the D-Day chapel. My brother had made all the liturgical and musical arrangements with a clear eye to tradition and dignity. I rather pity those Anglo-American families to whom the Navy hymn was not part of the emotional furniture. Its words and music are impossibly stirring, even to one who finds the opening words, Eternal Father, doubtly problematic. The tune is actually called Melita, after an old name of the island of Malta, where St. Paul was shipwrecked, and was written for someone who was about to take a ship across the Atlantic for the United States. My own text was from the same Paul of Tarsus, and from his epistle to the Philippians, which I selected for its non-religious yet high moral character. Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. Try looking that up in a modern version of the New Testament, Philippians 4, chapter 8, verse 8, and see what a ration of bland doggerel you get. I shall never understand how the keepers and trustees of the King James Version threw away such a treasure. But that very thought, if you like, is partly taken from my father's legacy of suspicion, of change, and of resistance to the rude shock of the new. The commander had no surviving friends to speak of, and in the misty churchyard there were only a few gaunt Hampshire faces with that Hitchens look, the look of the tough South English peasant that one can sometimes also see in Georgia and the Carolinas. These distant kinsmen have a hasty clasp of the hand and faded back into the chalky landscape. It was all stark enough to have pleased my father at his most downbeat, and absence of fuss could be noted. I suddenly remembered the most contemptuous word I had ever heard the old man utter. Discovering me lying in the bath with a cigarette, a book, a perilously perched glass, I must have been attempting some adolescent version of the aesthetic. He almost barked, "What is this? Luxury?" That this was another word for sin drawn from the repertory of antique Calvinism, I immediately understood. That my mother would have approved, though perhaps languidly preferring a chaise lounge to a bath, I also knew. So here you have my two much opposed and sharply discrepant ancestral stems, two stray branches that only war and chance could ever have caused to become entwined. I ought not to overstate the contradictions, one of the two apparently stern and flinty, and martial and continent and pessimistic, the other exotic and beseeching and hopeful and tentative. Yet the first one very much less sturdy than it should by rights have been. Even though it has left me with a strong sense of fight or flight on family occasions, and a real dread of clan occasions such as birthdays and Christmas and other moments of mandatory gaiety, I am grateful enough for the blessed anxiety and unease that it has bequeathed to me.